Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another video, and today I want to have a chat about the novels that inspired The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst. So hello, if you are new here, my name's Katie Lumsden, and as well as being a booktuber and an editor, I'm also an author of historical fiction. And my new novel, The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst, is coming out later this week, which is very exciting. So it's coming out on the 18th of July, and it is a work of historical fiction set in 1841 in the fictional town of Melford, in the fictional county of Wickenshire. I think we can all agree that Wickenshire is a very beautiful place. And this book basically follows all the gossip and drama in a small community after the unexpected marriage of one of their most eligible gentlemen. It's out in the UK on Thursday in hardback, audiobook and ebook. I'll also leave down below some international links to where you can get it internationally. If you're in the US or Canada, the best place to buy a copy is through Blackwell's, who are a UK bookshop who do international shipping, and I'll leave some other links down below to where you can buy it in some other countries. But yeah, I'm very excited about this novel, and I thought it might be fun to talk about some of the novels that inspired it, because this book has been very inspired by a few 19th century authors and a few 19th century novels, and I thought it would be nice to have a chat about them today. When my debut novel, The Secrets of Hartwood Hall, came out last year, I spoke a lot about this being a love letter to Victorian literature and a love letter to the Brontes. And I feel like The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst is a love letter to 19th century literature more broadly, and although there are other books and authors that have influenced it, it's really a love letter, I would say, to three specific authors. So I'll start off with those three authors, and then I'll talk about some other books that I think had an impact on this book. As it is currently Jane Austen July on BookTube, and if you don't know what that is, I'll leave some links down below. I thought I would start off with Jane Austen. One of the reasons why I have been saying that The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst is a love letter to 19th century literature rather than Victorian literature is because I do feel that Jane Austen was a massive influence on this book, and obviously she is an earlier 19th century author before the Victorian period. Also, The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst is set in 1841, right at the very, very beginning of the Victorian period, only a few years after Queen Victoria came to the throne. So it really is a kind of early Victorian first half of the 19th century novel, rather than a sort of high Victorian, late Victorian book. Jane Austen was definitely a massive influence on The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst, and I think if you read it, you will hopefully see that. In terms of the small town drama, the humour, the characters, the writing style, I guess in some ways, though I'll talk about another author who was definitely a massive influence on the writing style of this book in a minute, but I was quite aware of the influence Jane Austen was having on this book as I was writing it. I love Jane Austen, I'm a massive fan of her books. I've loved them for a really long time, and I especially love the way she looks at small communities and the marriage market, and that is something that my novel is looking at a lot. So I would say that the kind of whole body of work of Jane Austen was quite influential on this book, but there are two Jane Austen books specifically which I think had a really big impact on The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst, one of which is Pride and Prejudice and the other of which is Emma. These two books for me feel most like Jane Austen's small town novels. Highbury as a place plays a really important role in Emma, and the claustrophobia of Highbury, the fact that Emma has never left, how small and insular a community this is, and therefore how much like influence they all have over each other's lives. That was definitely something I was trying to capture in Melford in The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst. And the role of Meryton in Pride and Prejudice I find really interesting as well, and was thinking about a lot as I was working on the book. There are also quite a few characters in the novel who I think have definitely been influenced by characters in Jane Austen's books. There is a particular dynamic slash sequence of events in Montgomery Hurst that was quite influenced by a particular thing in Pride and Prejudice, and I feel like I can't really tell you much more about it because I feel like it would be a bit of a spoiler, or not necessarily like a huge spoiler, but it might nudge you in a direction that I don't know if I want you to know about yet, so I'm not going to say more than that. In a way, I would kind of expect me to be the most influenced by Pride and Prejudice because it is my favourite Jane Austen book, but I actually feel like there's a lot more Emma influence in Montgomery Hurst. One of the main characters in the book, Amelia Ashpoint, is a young woman who is 23 years old, has ambitions of being a writer. Amelia Ashpoint is not very impressed by many of her neighbours, and I think at times she has a touch of Emma about her. There's also two older spinsters in the novel, Miss Madden and Miss Waterson, who love to chat and gossip. Amelia thinks they're very silly, and I would be lying if I said that they weren't quite influenced by Miss Bates, but I gave Miss Bates a friend, and I love them. They are two of my favourite characters. I mean, I love everyone in the book, but they were a joy and a pleasure to write. Interestingly, I was chatting to my publicist and my publishers, and she said, oh, is Amelia Ashpoint inspired by Jane Austen? Because Amelia, as I said, is a young woman who loves to write novels and is a little bit rebellious and definitely has that sort of mean wit that you see in Jane Austen's letters. And I definitely didn't purposefully base Amelia on Jane Austen, but I also feel like maybe that was subconsciously in my head that I wanted to create that kind of character. I also actually borrowed a couple of surnames from Jane Austen, which I don't think I super consciously did. Obviously, the Hursts are important characters in The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst, and there is obviously a Mrs Hurst in Pride and Prejudice. I didn't consciously even think about the fact that I was using a name from Pride and Prejudice there. Hurst is just a good old 19th century name. And there is also an Elton family in Montgomery Hurst, and obviously there are some Eltons in Emma. The Mrs. and Miss Elton in The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst are nothing to do with the Eltons in Emma. There is a pride in common between those characters, but I didn't purposely take that name necessarily. I think it was one of those things where when I was writing The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst at the beginning, I took a lot of surnames from a lot of different 19th century novels because it's often a good way of making the names sound suitably historic. And I ended up changing quite a few of them or cutting characters. Like in the very first draft, I had quite a lot of Dickens surnames, which are all now gone from the book. But somehow the Eltons just always remained the Eltons, and they could never be anyone but the Eltons. So they remained the Eltons. So I definitely think Jane Austen has been a really big influence on Montgomery Hurst. But another author who has been a massive influence is definitely Elizabeth Gaskell. Again, all of Elizabeth Gaskell's work, I think, but there are two books specifically which I think were a really big influence on this. So first, let me speak about Cranford, which is a wonderful Elizabeth Gaskell novel that I absolutely love. And I feel like this was a massive influence on Montgomery Hurst because Cranford has a lot in it about gossip, and so does Montgomery Hurst. It's also very much a small town novel. In fact, Cranford is all about this small town. All the sort of middle and upper class people in this town are all women, and this book looks at this community of women in this really glorious way. Cranford was a massive influence on The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst, and I was really pleased actually when I was reading through some of the reviews on NetGalley. Quite a few people had spotted or felt the Jane Austen influence and also the Cranford influence, which really made me smile. I think what I really wanted to do in The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst was create a town and a community that felt as real to me and that hopefully feels as real to readers as Cranford does when I read Cranford. And that also has the same tonal balance as Cranford, because Cranford is hilarious and I hope Montgomery Hurst is funny. I think it's funny. I hope other people think it's funny too. But also, Cranford has a lot of very serious bits and deals with some more serious themes, and so does this. And not everything is completely happy and cheerful at all. It is, in a way, lighter in tone than Hartwood Hall, my first book, but in other ways it isn't. So I kind of wanted to capture the tone of Cranford, and hopefully I have. I don't know. Another Gaskell novel that was a huge influence for me was Wives and Daughters. This is a wonderful novel that is a coming-of-age story and a fantastic love story about a young woman called Molly Gibson. She is living in a small town. She's a daughter of a doctor, but she also ends up kind of making friends with the family of the local squire. And early on in the book, her father decides to remarry, and suddenly a new stepmother and stepsister are in her life, and this shifts everything. Wives and Daughters was one of the Victorian books that really made me understand small town and rural communities and class relationships in those communities. Molly lives in the town. She is the daughter of a doctor. She is middle class, but also within their neighbourhood there are the kind of county families who are the wealthy, aristocratic and or gentry people living nearby, squires, lords and ladies, and the sort of class dynamics between these different groups of people is so well explored in Wives and Daughters and is so interesting, and that's something I kind of really wanted to write about in The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst, the sort of town versus county divide in sort of smaller communities in the first half of the 19th century, because it's just something I find fascinating. Also, like Cranford, Wives and Daughters does look quite a lot at gossip and reputation, another thing I talk a lot about in Montgomery Hurst, and I feel like this book was just a really big influence. I also love the way that Gaskell writes with a lot of details, and I even remember at one point listening to the audiobook of Wives and Daughters, and whenever Elizabeth Gaskell would describe a piece of furniture, I would make a particular note on my phone of something to add into Montgomery Hurst. The way she described houses definitely influenced me a lot, I guess. And yeah, this is a wonderful book that I really, really recommend. Now, if you look at the blurb of The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst, it says at the bottom that this is a love letter to Jane Austen and Elizabeth Gaskell. And it is. But it is very much also a love letter to Anthony Trollope. But unfortunately, Anthony Trollope is in general less well known, and therefore it does not say so on the blurb of the book. But I know in my heart that this book is a massive homage to Anthony Trollope, and that this book is hugely influenced by Trollope, possibly even more than Gaskell or Austen. If you read The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst, and actually if you listen to the first chapter, which I have read on YouTube, so I'll leave that link down below, but the style of it is quite different to Hartwood Hall. And in general, something I really enjoy when writing is trying to write in different styles, and, you know, suiting the style of the novel to the story of the novel, because not all stories need to be told in the same way. And I feel like the style of Montgomery Hurst, I was trying to go for a bit of a blend of Jane Austen, Elizabeth Gaskell and Anthony Trollope, and I think Anthony Trollope must have impacted it quite a lot. I really love Anthony Trollope's books a lot. I find them really funny, and I find they have a really nice way of looking at character, which is something hopefully that I have tried to put into Montgomery Hurst. But I also really love the way that he looks at small towns and rural settings, and also the way that he looks at class, and the way that he looks at the marriage market and complexities in marriage and the difficulties surrounding romantic relationships. And I think another thing I really like about Anthony Trollope is that, you know, lots of 19th century novels kind of end with the declaration of love, but Anthony Trollope quite often looks at, say, the course of an engagement, or something like that. So he often looks at okay, so two people love each other or think that they love each other, but there are probably lots of other reasons why they might not just be able to simply get married. So let's have a look at those problems. And that's something that I really, really like and value in his books. And that's something I, you know, wanted to try and write about in The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst. There are lots of different love stories going on in this book, and they are at different stages. And hopefully that is something fun and interesting that I really like in Anthony Trollope, and that hopefully he would like in Montgomery Hurst. I have read a lot of Anthony Trollope novels by now, so it would be very hard for me to pick the specific ones that inspired this novel. I think it's probably fair to say that all of his small town rural novels, you know, Orley Farm, The Belton Estate, The Vicar of Bullhampton, they probably all had an influence to how I wrote and rewrote Montgomery Hurst. And I also think the Barsetshire Chronicles had a massive, massive influence on the way I wrote The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst. I had been writing this novel on and off for a really, really long time, and I had read a lot more Anthony Trollope by my rewrites than the first time I started writing it, but I think probably I was writing my first draft around the time I was reading the Barsetshire Chronicles. I think that's probably right, and I definitely think it had a big influence. If you don't know, Anthony Trollope wrote this amazing series of 6 interconnected novels, all set in the same fictional county of Barsetshire. I'm just holding up 2 here to stand in for the whole series of 6, but I love these novels so much, and I think they are truly fantastic. So obviously Anthony Trollope's books are set in the fictional county of Barsetshire, and that was probably the reason why I decided to create my own fictional county of Wickenshire for The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst. Am I going to write a series of 6 interconnected novels set in the same county? Basically, I feel like that would be lovely, but I also feel like that's not especially commercially viable plan. So we will see. I don't think I'm done with Wickenshire. I really love how Anthony Trollope creates this fictional county in his series, and I kind of wanted to do the same because I thought it would be really fun. There's also actually one Anthony Trollope novel that I read after I had written a first draft of The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst, which had an element in it that is important in Montgomery Hurst. And I feel like if I had read it earlier, it would have been a massive influence on Montgomery Hurst. And it probably still was a bit of an influence, but maybe less so. I don't feel like I can say what that book is without spoiling things in Montgomery Hurst. But I have read upwards of 30 Anthony Trollope books by now, so I feel like I can safely say there was an Anthony Trollope book I read that influenced the book without you having any idea what one it might be. But maybe if you have read that Trollope book and you read Montgomery Hurst, you might notice. I don't know. But anyway. So those are the 3 really big authors who I think had the most influence on The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst in terms of its tone and style and kind of what I was trying to do with it. I hope that if you read Montgomery Hurst, you will feel the love of 19th century literature there, as well as the book kind of looking at, you know, things that weren't spoken about or weren't able to be spoken about as much in 19th century fiction. But while those three authors are the kind of biggest influences, there definitely are quite a lot of other books and authors who have influenced the book. And actually, I have to confess a shocking fact that the initial idea for The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst actually came from something I read in a George Eliot book, which I think is shocking because, as many of you will know if you've been watching this channel for a long time, I don't really like George Eliot's books that much, which, you know, one is generally considered a bit blasphemous for someone who loves 19th century literature, but also obviously a lot of people love her books a lot. And I have really tried very hard with George Eliot. I have read 5 out of her 7 novels, and I just don't really get on with her books. But I do think that the way George Eliot looks at kind of small communities, small towns, and sort of the difficulties of the marriage market in Middlemarch, like, that definitely did influence Montgomery Hurst. And there's also one very specific thing in a George Eliot book which gave me the initial idea for the book. But I can't tell you what it is because it's a double spoiler, as it were, for the George Eliot book and for Montgomery Hurst. But I do find it very entertaining that this novel, in its like initial tiny spark of idea, did come from something I read in a George Eliot book. Does that mean that I should continue with George Eliot and read her other 2 novels? Because even if I don't like them, maybe they'll inspire me to write something else. I don't know. I do find it very entertaining that, although I don't get on with George Eliot at all, thinking about something in one of her books that I wanted to know more about, because whenever I read George Eliot, I'm like, why, George Eliot, did you focus on that character? I wish you'd written about that character. There was one thing in one of her books where I was like, oh, well, if that had been something slightly different, wouldn't that be interesting? And then Montgomery Hurst happened. I also think that sort of more broadly, both Thomas Hardy and Margaret Oliphant were probably influences on this book. I think the books I've read from Margaret Oliphant's Carlingford Chronicles and also Hester probably had their influence here, and lots of Thomas Hardy books as well. Again, the way Thomas Hardy writes about marriage and class has been really, really interesting for me as someone who's interested in 19th century history, and I'm sure that has fed into Montgomery Hurst. And there are also a few other books that kind of look at gossip that definitely were an influence on this book. Thinking especially of Deerbrook by Harriet Martineau and also The Tenant of Wildfire Hall by Anne Bronte. Those 2 books look quite a lot at gossip and reputation, and how those things can affect people in the 19th century, especially in smaller communities. And I feel like that was something that I definitely wanted to write about in Montgomery Hurst. As I have said, The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst is set in 1841, and I had sort of very specific reasons for setting it in the very early Victorian period, because I wanted this book to be about a moment in time where things are changing, and especially where sort of social and class dynamics are changing. We're into the start of the Victorian period, industrialisation is a big deal now, and the middle classes are starting to have more power, and the landed gentry's power is not perhaps as secure as it used to be. And that's something I really wanted to write about in this book, and I really wanted to set this book, you know, right at the start of the Victorian period to explore that. But something else I really enjoy doing as someone who loves 19th century literature is putting lots of references to 19th century literature into my books. And, you know, in a novel that is set in 1841, the characters can't be talking about any books that weren't out by 1841. There are a few characters in this book who really love to read, and I had fun thinking about what books they might be talking about. So when I was thinking about setting a book in 1841, I thought quite a lot about early Dickens novels, also about Harriet Martineau. Her novel Deerbrook came out in 1839. I also thought a bit about Frances Trollope, Anthony Trollope's mother, who was very active as a writer in the early part of the Victorian period. I'm not sure if I actually did mention Frances Trollope by name in this book in the end. I'm not sure I did. So when I was writing this book, I was looking for a book that came out in 1841 that I knew was published like in the year that this book is set. And I came across the novel Night and Morning by Edward Bulwer Lytton. And I had a scene where the characters mentioned it, but I hadn't actually read it at the time. So I ended up reading Night and Morning last of October in order to make sure that I wanted to reference it in this book. And certain things ended up being like quite thematically appropriate. So that was really fun. And I really enjoyed Night and Morning. So that didn't necessarily have an influence on this book, but it is one of the books that is mentioned in this book, and I had fun kind of doing the research, looking at what books would have been being published and been out in the year when this book is set. And of course, the characters also do talk about Jane Austen, whose books have been out for quite a few years by this point, and it was really fun to write about characters enjoying Jane Austen, because, you know, who doesn't? So I think those are all the books that I wanted to kind of mention today that I think had a really big impact on The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst. I hope this has been an interesting video and has made you interested to find out more about this book. As I said, it comes out on Thursday and I'm very, very excited for it to be released. I will be making some other videos over the next few weeks and months about this book. I'm probably going to do a video talking about my sort of historical research for this at some point soon, and at some point in a few months' time when some people have had a chance to read it, I'll probably do a Q&A as well. I remember for Hartwood Hall I did both like a spoiler-free and a spoilery Q&A, so I'll probably try and do that again because I think that's quite fun, but I'll probably wait till the book has been out for a little bit longer. I am really, really excited for this novel to come out. As I said, this is a book I have been working on for a long time, on and off, and that I really, really love. And obviously, like, I loved my debut novel, The Secrets of Hartwood Hall, but like, I love this book more. That's all that I wanted to say for today. Do let me know down in the comments if you've read any of the classics I spoke about today, if you enjoyed them, what you thought of them. Otherwise, that's all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.